1958, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Population, 43,000. A city of cattle auctions, cold winters, and Sunday church bells. Nothing about the flat, windswept landscape of southeastern Wyoming suggested that what was being quietly surveyed beneath those fields would one day hold the power to end life on Earth multiple times over. Imagine driving the two-lane highways that cut across the high plains today. You pass a wire fence, a gravel access road, a small concrete cap barely visible above the frost-cracked soil. You keep driving because there is nothing remarkable to see. And that, precisely, is the point. Beneath your wheels, buried 60 feet down inside a hardened steel cylinder weighing hundreds of thousands of pounds, sits a Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile, armed, fueled, ready. There are 150 of them out there, dispersed across Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado, each one capable of delivering a thermonuclear warhead to a target thousands of miles away in less than 30 minutes. They have been there, largely forgotten by the public, since the early 1960s. They have never been fired in war. They have never been deactivated. They are still armed right now, as you watch this. And in January 2026, a tranche of newly declassified Pentagon documents, released under a long-delayed Freedom of Information request, revealed something that nuclear analysts and arms control experts immediately called alarming. The full operational status of these weapons, the unreported accidents, the near misses, and the extraordinary lengths to which the United States government went to keep all of it hidden from the people living directly above them. This is that story. To understand how 150 nuclear missiles came to be buried beneath the Wyoming plains without most Americans ever giving them a second thought, you have to go back to the most terrified decade in modern history. The 1950s. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, shocking American military planners who had assumed they had years, perhaps decades, of nuclear monopoly ahead of them. By 1953, the Soviets had tested a hydrogen bomb. The arms race was no longer theoretical. It was existential. The United States Air Force launched its intercontinental ballistic missile program with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. The early Atlas and Titan missiles required enormous above-ground launch complexes, expensive, vulnerable, impossible to hide. Soviet satellites could locate them. Soviet warheads could destroy them on the ground before a single American missile ever left its pad. The entire premise of nuclear deterrence, the idea that the threat of retaliation would prevent a first strike, collapsed if your weapons could be wiped out before you even had the chance to respond. The Minuteman changed everything. Small enough to be stored in an underground silo, solid fueled, meaning it needed no time-consuming preparation before launch. Accurate enough to strike a target the size of a city block from 7,000 miles away. And cheap enough, relatively speaking, to be produced in the hundreds. The Air Force wanted them everywhere, not clustered together where one bomb could destroy many, but dispersed across millions of acres of lightly populated land, making them extraordinarily difficult to neutralize. Wyoming, with its vast, flat, federally owned or leased rangeland and its sparse population, was a planner's dream. The construction program that began in 1960 was one of the largest public works projects in American history, and one of the most secretive. Thousands of workers descended on the high plains. They dug, they poured concrete, they installed blast doors thick enough to survive a near-direct nuclear detonation. They buried hundreds of miles of underground communication cables. They built 150 missile silos and 15 launch control centers across a deployment area covering roughly 8,500 square miles. The cost, in today's dollars, ran into the tens of billions, and it was accomplished in large part while neighboring ranchers were told only that the government was conducting routine infrastructure surveys. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Each silo was separated from its nearest neighbor by at least 3 miles, the calculated minimum distance to prevent a single incoming warhead from destroying 2 simultaneously. Each launch control center sat at the hub of 10 silos, buried underground, staffed around the clock by 2 Air Force officers whose only task was to remain ready at any moment to turn 2 keys in unison and launch up to 10 nuclear missiles. They worked 12-hour shifts in a capsule the size of a large caravan. They ate there. They slept there. They stared at screens and waited. For years, for decades. The government knew that full public awareness of what was being constructed might generate opposition, fear, or protest. So they managed the narrative carefully. Press releases use sterile, bureaucratic language about deterrence posture and strategic readiness. The actual warhead yields, each Minuteman III carries a weapon with a destructive power up to 30 times that of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, were never advertised. The workers who built the silos signed secrecy agreements. The ranchers whose land sat above the missile fields were compensated with modest annual lease payments and advised not to dig too deep. And so the missiles went into the ground and the planes went quiet again. The construction itself was a masterpiece of concealment disguised as mundane activity. In the early 1960s, convoys of military vehicles were a common enough sight across Wyoming that locals barely paused to watch them. The Air Force leased access roads from ranchers under the cover of telecommunications maintenance work. The excavation crews that followed were enormous, sometimes hundreds of workers at a single site, but they moved fast and they moved on. Where a cattle pasture had stood in the spring, by autumn there was once again a cattle pasture. Barely visible above the grass was a small steel hatch, flush with the earth, locked with a combination known only to the Air Force. Beneath it, a concrete-lined shaft descended 60 feet to the missile itself, cradled in a shock-mounted launch tube engineered to absorb the ground shock of a nearby nuclear detonation and remain fully functional. The silos were not hidden from Soviet aerial surveillance. American planners assumed the Soviets would map them all, and they were correct. The point was never invisibility. The point was survivability. You would need to strike each silo almost directly to destroy it, and with 150 silos spread across thousands of square miles, the mathematics of Soviet first strike planning became catastrophically expensive. But there was a problem. The men and women assigned to maintain and operate these weapons were living a psychological existence that had no precedent in military history. The 2-person crews of each launch control center, always 2, never 1, a system known as the 2-man rule, designed to prevent any single individual from launching a nuclear war unilaterally, descended every day into a capsule suspended on enormous shock absorbers beneath the Wyoming soil, and they waited. They ran checklists. They verified equipment status. They rehearsed launch procedures until the sequence of steps became pure muscle memory. And then they waited some more. The same capsule, the same screens, the same partner, the same terrible purpose, week after week, month after month, year after year. What the declassified documents released in 2026 now make starkly clear is that the psychological and procedural strains of this existence produced incidents that were systematically downplayed or concealed entirely from the public record. There were cases of crew members removed mid-tour for behavior the Air Force deemed concerning, officers who expressed doubts, who asked too many questions, who in one documented 1973 case refused to complete a simulated launch exercise and was quietly reassigned without any disciplinary record that would attract outside scrutiny. Equipment malfunctions were logged as minor that in hindsight were anything but. In 1980, at a Titan II facility in Arkansas, a different missile system, but a chilling preview of what could happen anywhere on the American missile fields, a dropped socket wrench ruptured a fuel tank, triggering an explosion that flung the 740-ton blast door off the silo and hurled the nuclear warhead into a ditch 300 feet away. The warhead did not detonate, not because of any design safeguard, investigators later admitted. What they discovered next was even more disturbing. The newly released files contain incident reports from the Wyoming missile fields, filed internally, never published, describing equipment anomalies, unauthorized access attempts at silo perimeters, and at least 3 separate occasions between 1966 and 1989 when launch control systems entered what the documents describe in careful bureaucratic language as an anomalous ready state. The precise meaning of that phrase is still being parsed by nuclear analysts. What it appears to describe is a condition in which the normal software interlocks that prevent accidental launch were temporarily bypassed or rendered non-responsive. In each documented case, the incident was resolved before any command was issued. In each case, the official determination was that no launch was ever genuinely close to occurring. But the documents also reveal that in at least one instance, the crew in the capsule were not informed of the anomaly in real time. They were told afterwards. Quietly. The report was classified the same day. Records tell a different story from the public posture of total safety that the Air Force maintained throughout the Cold War. There is a fundamental paradox at the heart of nuclear deterrence that military planners understood very well and rarely discussed openly. A weapon that cannot be launched quickly enough is no deterrent at all. But a weapon that can be launched too easily is a catastrophe waiting for a trigger. The Minuteman system was designed to be launchable within minutes of receiving a valid presidential order. Every safety mechanism, every electronic lock, every authentication code, every procedural check represented a delay, and delay was the enemy of credibility. So the safety systems were, by design, kept lean. For years, the launch-enable switches on American Minuteman missiles were reportedly set to a code of 8 zeros, a deliberate administrative decision to ensure that no procedural stumble would ever delay a launch command. The missiles were, in a very real sense, engineered to fire easily. The two-man rule and the command authority chain were the true safeguards, and those were human beings, sitting underground in Wyoming, in a small room under enormous pressure, with all the frailty and fallibility that implies. The concealment operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the local level, it was enforced by silence and social convention. Ranchers whose land sat directly above silo access roads knew something significant was buried beneath their pastures, but a combination of modest lease payments, deep patriotic sentiment, and the cultural weight of a state intimately connected to military service ensured that few questions were asked aloud. At the national level, the Air Force practiced strategic ambiguity, publishing enough information about the Minuteman force to send a credible deterrent signal to Moscow, while withholding enough to prevent the American public from fully comprehending what had been placed in their midst without their meaningful consent. Congressional oversight existed, but it operated inside classified sessions that never reached the public domain. The arms control community tracked the missiles carefully. The general public did not. And so for decade after decade, 150 nuclear warheads sat beneath the Wyoming high plains in a state of permanent silent readiness, while the world above them carried on with cattle ranching and weather watching and Friday night football under an enormous, indifferent sky. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved. The existential confrontation that had justified the Minuteman fields evaporated, in rhetoric at least. Arms control treaties reduced the total American nuclear arsenal substantially over the following decade. Hundreds of silos across Montana, North Dakota, and Missouri were decommissioned. The concrete caps were blown off. The launch tubes were filled with rubble. Satellite imagery confirmed the destruction, and many Americans assumed, reasonably enough, that the same quiet dismantling had played out across the Wyoming plains. It had not. While the overall force was reduced and consolidated, F.E. Warren Air Force Base outside Cheyenne retained its full complement of 150 missiles. Today, the 90th Missile Wing based at Warren controls those weapons, and by every publicly available measure, they remain on continuous alert status. The missiles are ready. The warheads are armed. Young Air Force officers still rotate through those underground capsules, 12 hours at a time, running the same checklist their predecessors ran in 1963. The Cold War is history. The missiles are not. What makes the post-Cold War situation strange, and what the 2026 document release has made stranger still, is a growing body of reported anomalies from above the missile fields. Ranchers and rural residents within the deployment area have, over the past 3 decades, described unusual activity above known silo locations. Unmarked helicopters maintaining low altitude over specific grid squares, ground vehicles that respond with aggressive immediacy to civilian proximity to access roads, and on at least 4 occasions cataloged by local news outlets in Wyoming and Nebraska, unexplained communications blackouts across defined rural areas that coincided precisely with what the Air Force later described only as routine maintenance windows. Independent researchers tracking publicly available contracting documents have identified tens of millions of dollars in undisclosed upgrade work performed on facilities across the Wyoming deployment area between 2019 and 2024. Work filed under procurement codes associated with command and control modernization. What exactly was upgraded and what condition the older systems were in before that work began remains classified. The missiles themselves are not new. The Minuteman III entered operational service in 1970. The airframes in the Wyoming fields are not the originals. They have been extensively refurbished over the decades, but the fundamental weapon system is over 50 years old. It is scheduled, under current Pentagon planning, to be replaced by the new Sentinel ICBM program sometime in the 2030s. Until that day arrives, 150 Cold War missiles sit in their holes beneath the Wyoming plains, armed and waiting, tended by young officers who were not yet born when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, standing watch over a deterrent whose origins stretch back to a fear most of the living world has never personally experienced. What is the legacy of Wyoming's missile fields? It depends entirely on how you choose to frame the question. Frame it through the logic of deterrence, and the answer is a qualified success. The missiles were never fired in war. The nuclear exchange they were designed to prevent never came, and the high plains remain the setting for cattle ranching rather than catastrophe. Frame it through the lens of democratic accountability, and the picture darkens considerably. A weapon system of near unlimited destructive potential was built in deliberate secrecy, operated under layers of classification, experienced anomalies that were systematically concealed from the public record, and has remained on permanent armed alert for over 60 years, without any meaningful national conversation about whether that arrangement still reflects a considered conscious choice by the people living above it. The documents released in January 2026 do not answer that question. They do not explain the anomalous ready states or fully account for what occurred in those capsules during the long, strange decades after the Cold War ended. They are a partial opening of an archive that remains, in its vast majority, sealed. What they reveal is not the whole picture. They are simply the portion that someone, somewhere in the bureaucracy, finally decided we were allowed to see. 60 feet beneath the frost-heaved soil of the Wyoming high plains, in the silence and darkness below the cattle pastures, and the 2-lane highways, and the bright, cold, indifferent winter sky, the missiles are still there, the warheads are still live, the access codes are held by young officers in pressed blue uniforms who eat their meals underground, who sleep in capsules suspended on shock absorbers, who wait for an order they are trained to execute, and who hope quietly that it will never come.